They strapped me to a table to prove I was less human, so I made their science fail. The medical journal from 1851 still exists. It says, study inconclusive due to physiologically aberrant subject. That subject was Elijah Samuel. Strapped to an examination table for 8 days, while white physicians measured my pulse, my breathing, my pain responses. They were trying to prove that Negro physiology was fundamentally different, fundamentally inferior. My resting heart rate should have been 70 beats per minute. They measured 42. My pain response should have been immediate and visible. I showed nothing while they held candles near my skin. My reflexes should have matched their textbooks. They didn't. After 8 days, their measurements contradicted everything their theories predicted. So they declared the data unreliable and sent me back to the fields. What they never knew, what they couldn't know, is that I controlled every measurement. My mother taught me to slow my breathing during childhood fever. I used that same technique to drop my heart rate below what they expected. Field work taught me to disconnect from pain. I used that to stay blank-faced while they tested my limits. Years of surviving taught me stillness. I used it to make their reflexes tests fail. I didn't sabotage their science with my hands. I sabotaged it with my breath, my heartbeat, my refusal to be readable. Their paper exists in medical archives. My name doesn't appear in it, but their failure to measure me is recorded forever as methodological limitations. So I'm asking you now, if you're being reduced to data meant to prove your inferiority and you choose to be unmeasurable, is that resistance? Or is it just survival, and does calling it one instead of the other change the fact that their science couldn't hold me? They introduced as Elijah Samuel in a room de loud of camphor. The name was spoken like a label on a specimen jar. Not a person. Not a man with a history and thoughts and fear pooling in his stomach. Just Elijah Samuel. Subject for study. I stood in the center of the examination room while 3 white men in dark coats unpacked instruments from wooden cases. Glass tubes, metal calipers, a device with a rubber bulb and tubing, things I had no names for. The owner, who had brought me here, who had sold my time to these physicians for research, stood near the door. He was being paid. I understood this without hearing the transaction. Money was changing hands for access to my body. I kept still and quiet, conserving breath, making myself as unremarkable as possible. This was instinct learned from years of surviving inspections, auctions, medical examinations that determined my value. The less you reacted, the faster it ended. One of the physicians spoke to the others as if I could not hear, as if I was furniture. He said they would be measuring physiological responses, heart rate, respiration, skin temperature, reaction to stimuli. He said the study was to determine whether Negro physiology differed fundamentally from white physiology. He said this while looking at his instruments, not at me. I understood what I was. I was evidence they intended to collect. Data they would use to prove theories already formed. My body was the material through which they would confirm what they already believed. The first physician approached me. He told me to remain still. His voice was flat, clinical, empty of anything that acknowledged I might respond as a person rather than an object. He placed 2 fingers against my wrist, counting, his eyes on a pocket watch in his other hand. I felt my heart beating, felt the pulse under his fingers, felt the automatic response of my body to being touched by someone who held complete power over me in this moment. Then I remembered something from childhood. I had been sick at age 8, fever that lasted weeks. My mother, before they sold her, had taught me how to manage panic when breathing became difficult. She said, slow your breath, count, make each inhale longer than the one before. Your heart will follow your lungs. I did this now, without showing effort, without visible change in my posture or expression. I counted silently, extended each breath by fractions, felt my pulse slow under the physician's fingers. He frowned, looked at his watch again, adjusted his grip on my wrist. He counted longer this time, then released my hand and stepped back. He spoke to the other physicians, said the pulse was unusually slow, 42 beats per minute, below what he expected for a male of my approximate age and size. They discussed whether this was error, whether he had counted wrong, whether the watch was accurate. I stood still, eyes lowered, face neutral. They decided to repeat the measurement. This time a different physician took my pulse. He pressed harder, as if pressure would reveal truth his colleague had missed. I kept my breathing controlled, kept my heart rate low through conscious management of respiratory rhythm. The second physician confirmed the first measurement, 43 beats per minute, abnormally low. Confusion flickered across their faces. This was not what their theories predicted, not what the literature they had read suggested about Negro physiology. They moved to different tests. One physician produced a candle. He held the flame close to my forearm without touching skin. Heat radiated against my flesh. Not enough to burn, enough to cause discomfort. He watched my face, waiting for reaction, for flinch or pull away or any indication of pain response. I withdrew my attention from my body. This was another lesson learned from survival. When you cannot escape physical discomfort, you can disconnect from the part of you experiencing it. I focused on a spot on the wall behind them, made my eyes soft, made my breathing continue its slow, controlled rhythm, made my face empty of expression. The candle stayed near my arm for maybe 30 seconds, then moved away. The physician made notes, showed them to his colleagues. They discussed pain tolerance, whether it was diminished in Negroes, as some literature suggested, whether my lack of response indicated reduced sensitive. I knew better. I felt the heat, felt the discomfort. I just chose not to show it. This choice was not available to them as interpretation. They saw lack of response and concluded lack of feeling rather than controlled reaction. Their notes grew inconsistent as tests continued. They measured my respiration, found it slower than expected. They tested my temperature, found it lower than their baseline. They applied pressure to trigger reflexes, found responses that did not match their predictions. Each inconsistency created confusion. Each unexpected result made them question their methodology rather than their assumptions. I remained compliant without cooperation, did exactly what they asked, stood still when told to stand, sat when told to sit, allowed touch and measurement and observation, but I gave them nothing beyond compliance. No voluntary information, no reaction beyond what was physiologically unavoidable. A patron entered the room during the afternoon session, a wealthy man who had funded this research. He wanted to see results, wanted to observe the groundbreaking study he had paid for. The physicians showed him their notes, explained the anomalies, the unexpected measurements. The patron was not pleased. He had expected confirmation of existing theories, had expected data that would support his beliefs about racial difference. Instead, he was being shown confusion, inconsistency, results that did not fit the narrative. He said the tests should be repeated, that clearer results were needed, that the study's value depended on conclusive findings. The physicians agreed. They would intensify the examination, apply more rigorous methodology, eliminate variables that might explain the anomalous results. I was moved to another room, smaller, no windows, away from the possibility of witnesses. This shift in location made my chest tight. Isolation was how bad things happened, how people were broken without accountability. I memorized the sounds of the building as they led me through hallways, footsteps on wood floors, doors opening and closing, voices in distant rooms. Building a mental map in case escape became necessary. The new room contained a table, restraints, more instruments laid out in precise rows. One physician explained that they needed to control for voluntary responses, that the next phase would ensure my cooperation was not a factor in results. He said this while looking at the restraints. I understood. They were going to bind me, remove my ability to manage my responses through stillness or breath control. Fear moved through my body like cold water, but I kept it from my face, kept my breathing steady, gave them no visible reaction. They positioned me on the table, bound my wrists and ankles with leather straps, not tight enough to injure, tight enough to prevent movement. Night was approaching. The light coming through the high window in this room shifted from afternoon gold to evening gray. One physician said they would resume tomorrow, that I would remain here overnight, that attendants would monitor me to ensure I did not tamper with the equipment. Then they left. I lay on the table in the dimming room, strapped on, alone except for an attendant who sat near the door, half asleep, not looking at me. I tested the restraints carefully. They allowed minimal movement, enough to shift slightly, not enough to sit up or reach anything. I focused on breathing, on maintaining the slow rhythm I had established, on not allowing panic to accelerate my heart rate or create visible distress. This was control in the only form available. They had my body. They had access to measure and observe and test. But they could not have my interior state unless I gave it to them. I rested without sleeping, preserving whatever control remained. Through the door, I heard voices. The physicians discussing their findings, debating methodology, arguing about whether the anomalies indicated error or genuine difference in physiology. One voice insisted the subject me was somehow interfering with results, that voluntary control was creating false data. Another voice said that was impossible, that physiological responses were involuntary by definition, that a Negro subject would lack the sophistication to manipulate such measurements. They were both wrong and right. I was not sophisticated. I was just experienced in survival, in managing my body's responses to preserve some measure of dignity and control. But they could not see this, could not imagine that their subject had agency, had learned techniques from necessity that their medical training had not taught them. Morning came cold and gray. The physicians returned with new instruments, more precise tools, methods designed to eliminate what they called confounding variables. They explained still not to me, but about me to each other, that they would be measuring involuntary responses now, reflexes that could not be consciously controlled. They applied sharp pressure to specific points, watched for automatic reactions, measured the time between stimulus and response. I slowed my breathing further, made each inhale last 8 counts, each exhale 10. My body responded to their tests. Reflexes triggered, but the responses were muted, delayed, not matching the timeline their textbooks predicted. One physician said this was impossible, said the patellar reflex had a fixed latency that could not be altered voluntarily. But I had altered it, not through conscious control of the reflex itself, through management of my overall nervous system state through breathing. When your breathing is slow, when your heart rate is low, when your body is in a state of deep calm, reflexes process differently, not absent, just softer, slower. They did not understand this, could not understand it within their framework. Frustration rose in the room like humidity. Their voices grew sharper, their movements more abrupt. They tested my endurance next, applied sustained pressure to various points, timed how long I could maintain positions, measured fatigue markers. I responded minimally, conserved energy, made my body efficient in ways their measurements did not account for. Years of field labor had taught me how to work long hours without burning out, how to pace myself, how to make small amounts of energy do maximum work. I applied this knowledge now, made each movement economical, each response measured, each moment of stillness regenerative. Their data worsened, by which I mean it became more inconsistent with their expectations. One physician suggested equipment error, that the instruments were faulty, that measurements could not be trusted. Another insisted the subject was anomalous, that I represented some physiological outlier that did not reflect the general Negro population. A third proposed that the entire methodology was flawed, that attempting to measure racial difference through physiological response was fundamentally problematic. This suggestion was dismissed immediately. The study's funding depended on proving difference. Questioning the premise would end the research. So they blamed me, blamed the instruments, blamed anything except the possibility that their theories were wrong. I remained silent through these discussions, invisible despite being the subject of every sentence. Surveillance increased after 3 days of inconsistent results. An attendant was positioned to watch me, even during rest periods, to record my breathing rate while I slept, to note any behavior that might explain the anomalous data. I practiced stillness without stiffness during these observed rest periods, kept my body relaxed but my mind alert, aware that every breath was being counted, every movement noted. This constant observation was exhausting in ways physical labor had never been. There was no moment when I could fully relax, no privacy, no reprieve from being specimen. Fatigue set in for them as well. The physicians grew irritable with each other, snapped over small disagreements, argued about interpretation of data. Their patron visited again, demanded progress, wanted preliminary findings to present to his colleagues. The physician showed him pages of measurements, charts, numbers that contradicted each other, results that refused to form coherent patterns. The patron was angry, said he had paid for science, not confusion, said they should find a different subject if this one was defective. I heard this through the wall, understood that I was being blamed for their failure, that my body's refusal to confirm their theories made me defective rather than making their theories questionable. They attempted to provoke fear next, to see if emotional response would alter physiological measurements in ways that matched predictions. One physician told me, speaking directly to me for the first time, that if the study failed, I would be sold south to plantations where survival rates were measured in years rather than decades. He watched my face, watched my chest, waiting for my breathing to quicken, for my heart rate to spike, for fear to make my body readable. I emptied my face of reaction, made my eyes blank, kept my breathing at the same slow rhythm I had maintained for days. Inside, fear moved like rats in a cellar, but I kept it from the surface, kept it from my breath and pulse and skin temperature. The physician's threat was real. Being sold south was death sentence disguised as transfer, but showing fear would not prevent it, would only give them the data they wanted. So I chose to give them nothing, even in the face of threat, even when survival might have been served by compliance. This was the paradox. My best chance of leaving this study alive was to continue confounding it, to remain anomalous, to be too inconsistent to be useful data. If I became readable, if my fear showed, if my responses matched their predictions, I would cease to be interesting, would become just another data point, confirming what they already believed. But as long as I confused them, I remained a problem requiring solution. And problems keep you alive longer than conclusions do. Notes were rewritten multiple times, crossed out, adjusted. I watched them through half-closed eyes during rest periods, saw them changing numbers to fit narratives, saw them selecting which measurements to include and which to discard as error. This was familiar. I had seen records changed before, seen ages adjusted on sale documents, seen prices altered in ledgers, seen history rewritten to match present needs. The difference was that now I was watching science do what I had only seen commerce do before. The same erasure, the same selection of convenient truth over inconvenient fact. After 8 days, they declared the results unreliable. Not wrong, not challenging to their theories, just unreliable. This meant we cannot use this data to prove what we wanted to prove, therefore the data is defective. I prepared for removal, for being returned to my owner, for whatever consequences came from failing to provide the evidence they needed. The study ended on a Thursday morning. They unbound me from the table, gave me my clothes, told me to wait in the hall while they packed their instruments. I stood in the hallway, alone for the first time in 8 days, feeling the absence of restraints like phantom weight. I had survived, but I did not know yet what survival would cost. The instruments were packed away quickly. Wooden cases snapped shut, leather straps buckled, glass tubes wrapped in cloth and nestled into compartments. Everything stored with the efficiency of men who wanted to leave behind what had not worked. I stood in the hallway watching through the open door. No one spoke to me. No one explained what would happen next. This silence was familiar. It was the silence after failed inspections, after buyers decided you were not worth the asking price, after doctors examined you and found damage that reduced your value. I kept my posture compliant, my face neutral, waiting for whatever came next. The owner, who had brought me, arrived in the early afternoon. He spoke with the physicians in low voices. Money changed hands, a partial refund, I suspected. Compensation for unsatisfactory results. Then he gestured for me to follow him. We walked to his carriage in silence. He did not ask what happened, did not question why the study ended early. He had been paid either way. My experience was irrelevant to his interests. I climbed into the back of the carriage. We rode through the city streets, toward the plantation. The motion, the noise, the ordinary chaos of urban life felt strange after 8 days in controlled isolation. I was returned to ordinary duties, without explanation. The overseer assigned me to field work, said nothing about where I had been or why I was back, just pointed to a section of tobacco that needed harvesting and told me to start there. I picked up tools and went to work. My hands remembered the motions. My body fell into familiar rhythms. Other slaves working nearby glanced at me, curious, but not asking. Questions about where someone had been and why were dangerous. Better not to know. I worked through the afternoon, the sun hot on my back, the tobacco leaves rough against my hands, the earth solid under my feet. These sensations were real in ways the examination room had not been real. This was my body doing what it had been trained to do, not being measured, not being observed, just working. The relief was physical, like setting down a weight I had carried for so long I had forgotten it was not part of me. That evening in the quarters, I overheard two house slaves talking. They had heard from someone who had heard from someone else that the physicians had called their findings inconclusive, that the study had failed to produce usable results, that the subject me had been physiologically aberrant in ways that made the data unreliable. Inconclusive meant erased, meant the measurements existed but would not be published, would not enter the medical literature, would not be used to prove or disprove anything. I existed in those measurements. My controlled breathing, my managed heart rate, my refusal to show pain or fear in ways they could quantify. But now that existence would be filed away, forgotten, dismissed as anomaly rather than evidence. I stored this memory carefully, added it to the collection of moments when my humanity had been measured and found not to fit categories designed to exclude it. Interest in me faded quickly. Within weeks, no one mentioned the study. The house slaves who had gossiped about it moved on to other topics. The overseer forgot I had been gone. I became unremarkable again, just another field hand, valuable only while useful, forgotten when not actively needed. This was protection. Invisibility kept you safe from the kind of attention that had led to 8 days strapped to a table. I kept my abilities hidden after that. The breath control, the heart rate management, the pain tolerance, all the techniques I had used to confound their measurements. I used them only for survival, to endure long work days, to recover from injuries faster, to maintain some measure of internal control when external control was impossible. But I never demonstrated them, never showed that I possessed knowledge or capability beyond what was expected of a slave. Time passed. Months became years. I heard eventually that the physicians had published a paper, not about me specifically, about the challenges of measuring physiological difference across races, about methodological limitations, about the need for better instruments and more controlled conditions. They had turned their failure into academic discourse, had extracted meaning from data that refused to mean what they wanted. My name did not appear in their paper. I was not credited as subject, not acknowledged as the person whose body had generated the measurements they could not interpret. This was expected. Slaves were not named in medical literature. We were subjects or specimens or cases, numbers in data sets, not people. The papers left without my name attached. The record closed, without including me as participant in my own examination. I claimed no credit. Credit would have been dangerous, would have suggested I had agency in the process, that I had chosen to confound their measurements rather than being naturally confounding. Better to be forgotten. Better to be dismissed as anomaly. Better to fade from their memory entirely. The cost of being observed lingered in my body for years. I developed a wariness around medical examination, around being touched for assessment, around having my body treated as object of study rather than vessel of personhood. When the plantation doctor examined slaves for fitness, I made myself unremarkable, showed nothing that would invite closer inspection, gave him no reason to find me interesting. Being watched changes how you breathe, how you hold your body, how you move through space. For months after the study, I caught myself monitoring my own heart rate, checking if my breathing was too slow or too controlled, wondering if I had permanently altered something in myself through 8 days of constant management. I reclaimed control slowly, learned to let my body be without observation, to breathe without counting, to exist without constant awareness of being measured. This took years. The residue of those 8 days stayed with me long after the physicians forgot I existed. I am an old man now. The physicians are dead. The patron who funded the study is dead. The owner who sold my time is dead. But I am alive, and I remember. I remember lying on that table, bound and observed, measured and quantified, reduced to numbers that refused to form the patterns they wanted. I remember choosing to confound them, to use every technique I knew for managing my body's responses to make myself unreadable. This was not resistance in the way most people understand resistance. I did not refuse the study, did not fight the restraints, did not speak against their methods, but I refused to be legible, refused to let my body provide the evidence they needed, refused to fit into categories designed to prove my inferiority. This refusal was invisible, conducted through breath and pulse and managed response. No one watching would have seen it as defiance. But it was. It was the only defiance available to someone strapped to a table with instruments pressed against his skin. I speak now because the science could not hold me. Their measurements existed. Their notes were filed. Their paper was published. But I escaped definition, remained inconclusive, refused to be the data point they needed. This matters, not because it changed their theories, not because it prevented other studies or saved other subjects, but because it proved to me, if to no one else that even in positions of complete powerlessness, there are choices, small choices, internal choices, choices conducted through breath and stillness and managed response. I chose to control what I could control when everything else was controlled by others. I chose to make myself unreadable when being read would have confirmed their beliefs about my inferiority. The cost was 8 days of isolation, years of wariness, permanent alteration of how I inhabit my own body. But the result was, they could not use me, could not extract from my body the proof. They needed that I was fundamentally different and lesser. I remained human in ways their science could not capture, remained complex in ways their instruments could not measure. This is what I want you to understand. They tried to reduce me to numbers, to strip away everything except physiological response, to prove through measurement that my body revealed my nature. But bodies are not simple. Responses are not automatic. Humanity exists in the gaps between stimulus and reaction. I lived in those gaps, made them wider through conscious choice, used breathing and stillness, and controlled response to create space where I remained undefined. The physicians called this anomaly, called it unreliable data, called it methodological failure. But it was survival. It was refusal. It was the assertion of personhood through the only means available to someone whose personhood was denied. They published their paper about methodological limitations without understanding that I was the limitation, that my humanity was what their methods could not contain. They needed me to be simple, readable, confirmable, chose to be complex, unreadable, inconclusive. That choice was made breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, through 8 days of constant observation and years of carrying the cost. But it was still choice, still agency, still proof that even in the most controlled circumstances, the human will find ways to persist, The record they created shows measurements that contradict each other, results that refuse to form patterns, data that fails to support conclusions. What the record does not show is why, does not show the conscious management, the learned techniques, the survival knowledge applied in new context, does not show that behind every anomalous measurement was a choice I made to control my response, rather than letting their instruments record my involuntary reactions. I am telling you this now because the official record is incomplete, because history written by those in power erases the agency of those under study, because someone should know that when they strapped me to that table and pressed their instruments against my skin, I was not passive subject. I was active participant in my own illegibility, conscious architect of their methodological failure. They tried to m'informer, to reduce me to data that would prove their theories about racial difference. I refused, by remaining unmeasurable, by being human in ways their science could not capture. This refusal had no audience, no witnesses who understood what I was doing, no recognition or credit, just me and my breathing and my heartbeat and the small victories of remaining undefined. The physicians moved on to other studies, published other papers, built careers on research that assumed human subjects were legible through proper measurement. They never understood that some of us learned to be illegible, learned to control responses they believed were involuntary, learned to create confusion in their data through conscious management of our bodies. This knowledge was survival, was resistance, was the maintenance of humanity when humanity was denied. I carried it silently for 70 years, carried the memory of 8 days when I proved that their science could not hold me. Now I speak it, not because it changes history, not because it corrects their record, but because truth deserves witness even when witness comes too late for justice. I was measured, and I remained unmeasurable. I was studied, and I refused to be known. I was reduced to subject, and I stayed person, through breathing, through stillness, through choices so small they were invisible to everyone except me. The official record says the study was inconclusive, says the data was unreliable, says the subject was physiologically aberrant. But the truth is simpler and more complicated. I would not cooperate with my own reduction, and that refusal, invisible and unrecorded, was the most human thing I ever did.